Hello and welcome to the Siwi Sofa, where we sit down with some of the most interesting participants at this year's World Water Week to learn more about the array of water-related issues being discussed this week in Stockholm. My name is Eric Paglia, host of the Siwi Sofa, which is now broadcasting live or streaming live on the Siwi Media Hub. And the name of this session is Developing Social Norms for Community-Based Watershed Management. And joining me on the sofa is Catalina Mejia, the Director of Strategy and Development in Colombia for the International Conservation Organization, RARE. Welcome, Catalina. Very nice to have you here on the Siwi Sofa. Now, RARE specializes in inspiring local communities to change the way they interact with and manage their natural resources. And today we're talking about how this behavioral approach can be applied to watershed management. So, why are establishing social norms so important for watershed management?
Okay, so first I want to start by telling you a little bit how we see watershed management. So for us, integrated watershed management is the process of managing the interaction between human activities and the natural resources on a watershed. So for instance, like we have to understand that how people farm, how people use their forest and conserve their forest, how people use water, all of that have a direct impact on the quality and availability of water that we have. So if you want to have healthy watersheds, if you want to ensure the secure provision of fresh water, of energy, you have to conserve the forest in the watershed. So you have to make people to act differently. So if you want to make people to act differently, you have to appeal to social norms, because humans are not rational animals. Like, we are not rational beings, and we make decisions based not on rational arguments but on emotions, and based on the social norms that we see in our community. So if we really want people to farm differently, if we want people conserving the forest in the watersheds, we need to create these social norms and these new behaviors in the community to make sustainable changes for the effective management of the watershed.
It's a very human-centric approach as opposed to policy or technical.
Exactly.
And what is RARE doing to change behaviors around the use of water and its management?
So you just was talking you were talking about policy. So in Colombia, and I'm sure that in most of the countries, like, one of the main challenges for the government is actually making that local environmental entities, local governments, actually are effective in implementing national policy and getting communities to adopt the public programs and to adopt technical solutions. So that's what we are trying to do in Colombia. We train local environmental entities in Colombia, which I just said they are in charge of implementing national policy at the local level. So we build their capacity on how to engage communities, on how to mobilize local stakeholders to actively participate in the management of their own watershed resources. We do this through a methodology that we call Pride of ARA. Because, as I was saying before, we need to appeal to people's emotions. So we appeal to emotions like pride, which are very powerful emotions to drive sustainable behavior change. So this process is a systematic process that we have developed for the past 30 years, in which we developed this based on behavioral sciences. So we already understand how people react and how people make decisions. So first, we start by facilitating these participatory processes where people, local stakeholders, identify what's the problem and what are the behaviors that have to be changed in the watershed. Also, we work with the idea that we cannot come with preset solutions to the watershed, because each site has its own conditions. You know that hydrological, social, economical conditions are different in each watershed, so any technical solution is going to work differently in each of them. So we create these local watershed management committees that are responsible for identifying these solutions and these problems and identify what are the actions that are needed to address those problems. So after doing that, the local partner, which in this case is the local environmental authority and the local leaders that we train, are responsible for developing behavior change campaigns, which are the core of our methodology, in which we catalyze these new social norms to make people behave differently, to make people farm in a more sustainable way, to make people manage better their forest and use better the water resources. After we create these enabling conditions by creating the institutionality, by creating the awareness and the willingness of people to behave differently, we now have the conditions to go to the upstream landowners, which are the people that live and work in the watershed, and sign acuerdos recíprocos por el agua, which are basically agreements in which they commit to protect their forest and to farm differently in order to reduce the threats to the watershed and also like improve their livelihoods.
Well, it seems like you really have to know your environment there. You have to know the people. So a lot of understanding really goes into each of these environments that you work in.
Definitely.
And what kind of results are you seeing so far, and how do you measure success?
So this pride for ARA methodology leaves behind like a more strengthened local governance of water. So we see communities more organized. We see local governments with a better capacity to actually engage communities and execute their conservation initiatives. We see improved social cohesion. We see improved trust between communities and public institutions. Well, obviously, we also measure like water quality and increases in forest cover, in forest health, and all of that. But I think most importantly, the most important outcome of our methodology is that at the end, the results continue to grow even when the intervention ends. So one of the biggest challenges of any conservation initiative or of any public program is ensuring that the interventions are sustained even when the incentives or even when the external aid or the external resources ends. So since our approach is based on building the local capacities and transferring the knowledge and strengthening the institutions in place, we see that when the intervention ends, we see people continuing the process. We see conservation outcomes to continue to grow. So I think this sustainability issue and the capacity of the local entities like working in place are the most important outcomes of this methodology.
And what about this pride that you try to instill in the local populations? Does that also last beyond the end of the intervention?
Exactly. So for example, we create these schemes that are very similar to payment for environmental services schemes, in which the government uses economic incentives for like incentivizing people to change their practices or to conserve the forest or the ecosystems that they want to conserve. So since we instill this sense of pride of place and we instill this sense of responsibility and understanding of why it's important to protect the ecosystems upon which they depend for clean water and energy, so people continue to protect and continue the conservation action even when they don't have an economic incentive. So they react to their responsibility, to their pride, and that's how they continue their conservation action.
Can you say a bit more about how the other stakeholders like government and water utilities and the private sector fit into this? And how can they play a role in supporting positive social norms around water management in communities?
So if we really want like an integrated management of the watershed, we need the participation of all these actors. So we need municipalities, we need the water utilities company, we need the water users, we need the landowners, we need academia. All of them have a very important role to play. And I think what we have to do is to ensure that each of them know their role and what is their responsibility. So for example, water users are one of the main actors and responsible for ensuring the sustainability of resources. But if you ask people don't know where water comes from. They think that it comes from the faucet. So we have to create this sense of reciprocity and how they can contribute to protecting the ecosystems. People in Colombia don't know that most of the fresh water in Colombia comes from this Páramo and cloud forest. And also in Colombia, 75% of the energy is generated by hydropower. So people have to understand that for them to have clean water, to have energy, they have to conserve the watersheds. We have to create that sense of awareness and reciprocity first. The other important actor in this is the private sector. If we want this to work at scale, we need the financing. So we have already realized that public and philanthropy financing is not enough to finance this initiative at scale. So we see the private sector as an important actor, and we have more and more evidence every day on how conserving watersheds have economic benefits to, for example, big water users as water utilities and hydropower companies, which can reduce their cost of water treatment or reduce, for example, their maintenance cost of the infrastructure just by conserving the watershed. So it's a more cost-effective way of providing water and energy in this case.
We have several Siwi SOFA sessions this year discussing the coffee sector in Colombia. Does that fall within your work with RARE as well, or is that other parts of Colombia?
Definitely, we interact with those initiatives. Most of the inhabitants of the watersheds are smallholder farmers, which produce coffee, cacao. Most of them work in subsistence crops. So we have been working with the coffee farmers in how they can adopt and accelerate the adoption of these more sustainable practices, like using biodigesters or adopting silvopastoral practices. So that's exactly what we bring to the table, how these technical solutions that we already know that work are really adopted by the communities and sustained in the long term.
So what's next for mainstreaming behavior change and social norms into watershed management?
Well, I think we have to create the structures to make these successful community-based approaches to inform policy and to inform and to develop them at a scale that can contribute to national goals and even to international goals. So how can we create the structures to connect the different levels of governance? So we have the national government, like establishing policies, and then we have the local agencies implementing at the ground. But then there is a disconnection. They don't act in a coordinated way. So how we can get this to inform how policy is made, how we get different water users and stakeholders in not only contributing with the finance needed to scale this at a national and regional level. I think another challenge that we are currently actively working on is how we can convince project managers that creating trust, that building this social cohesion and building this strengthening local capacities are so important for the sustainability of projects. So one of the challenges is that maybe in some cases these processes with which lasts around 2 years, could increase the costs and the implementation time of projects, and a project manager doesn't want to do that. So how we can calculate the return on investment and demonstrate that long term this is a more cost-effective way of doing things.
Well, Catalina, thank you very much for joining us here in the Siwi Sofa and sharing with us this fascinating approach to watershed management that you've pioneered in Colombia.
No, thank you for having me on, for facilitating this conversation.
And thank you for tuning in to the Siwi Sofa. Stay tuned for more episodes throughout the World Water Week.